Hey everybody, it's Yolanda from Don't Get It Twisted Crochet, and I wanted to come and do a quick tutorial about turning chains and whether or not your turning chain counts as a stitch or how it affects the object or project you're making if it doesn't count as a stitch. The reason for this tutorial is because a few weeks ago I released my crochet heart blanket pattern. And been getting a few questions about how to make sure the edges on that blanket stay straight. I consider the pattern to be what I say it's an advanced beginner. There's nothing complicated about the stitches. The blanket is made completely of double crochet after your initial starting chain. It's just double crochet throughout. You do have to be comfortable with changing colors. But because there's this heart in the middle of the pattern, you also have to be very comfortable with counting your stitches and knowing what counts as a stitch and what doesn't count as a stitch. So that's the reason for this tutorial today. I am using the same yarn that I use for the pattern as well as the same hook that I use for the pattern. But for this tutorial purpose, I'm not doing a full blanket. I'm just doing a chain. I did a chain here of I think 12. Let's count it and see. Because that's, like I said, that's very important, being able to count your actual stitches. And so knowing what counts as a stitch and what doesn't count as a stitch can definitely affect how your particular project, in this case your blanket, turns out. So it's important to note that when you're chaining, the chain that's left on the hook, that stitch that's left on the hook, this right here, does not count as a stitch. I repeat, this that's on your hook does not count as a stitch. So when you're counting the stitches, your first stitch is that stitch after what's on your hook. So if we're counting, this would be 1 right here. That's stitch number 1 or chain number 1. And then we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then 12. So 12 chains here. 12 chains here for, like I said, tutorial purposes. And then in the pattern, I simply say that you double crochet in the second chain from the hook. So again, if this does not count as a chain and this is chain 1, then this is your second chain from the hook. Remember, this does not count as a chain. What's on your hook does not count. That's chain 1 here. This is chain 2. So we're just going to do a double crochet right into that second chain and then double crochet throughout. And so what we should end up with here at the end is, instead of 12 stitches, we should have 11 stitches here at the end, and we'll count them just to be sure that that's what we have, 11 stitches. Now in the crochet heart pattern, I say that the turning chain, or my chain 2 at the end, counts as your first stitch, and I'll talk about that a little more when we get to the end here. So I have, this should be 10, and then this, sorry, here should be 11, but we'll see if I'm right here. Okay, so that's the end of the row. And so if we're counting, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now I find it easy, especially when you're doing double crochet, to just count the posts that you have. Now in the pattern, I say that the turning chain counts starting with the second row. So in that first row, the only reason that we skipped, that I didn't do, because some patterns you'll see they'll say chain into the third or the fourth chain from the hook. That's because that when those skip stitches are going to count as the first stitch for them. In this case, I'm not counting that as the first stitch. My first stitch was actually where you crocheted. And so again, if you want to count them from the top, you can, and it's again going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Okay, and that's what you should end up with. If you're doing that pattern, then it should be one less than your starting chain. Okay, so then I say you chain 2 and you turn. This is what they mean by a turning chain. When you see that in a pattern, it says, you may see it abbreviated as TCH. That's the turning chain. I just say chain 2 and turn. I don't abbreviate mine as TCH. You chain 2 and turn. Now, a lot of people have asked me, if the blanket is double crochet, why am I only chaining 2 for my turn instead of chaining 3? I crochet really loose. And you will learn your crochet style. If you've been crocheting for a while, you know if you crochet really tight or crochet really loose. I crochet really loose, and so for me, a chain 3 is going to be too tall here. It's going to be too loose for me to do a chain 3 here, which is why I only do a chain 2. Now you may find that you crochet really tight, and so it requires you to do a chain 3 in order to get the height that you need. But like I said, I crochet loose, so a chain 2 is sufficient for me. Now, because I say this chain 2 counts as a stitch from here throughout the rest of the pattern, what that means is that this stitch counts for this space. So I will not put a stitch into the space here. Instead, my next stitch will go into the space here. And so we'll just continue to double crochet all the way to the end, and again we'll count those stitches so you can see that again you should end up with 11 stitches at the end of this row. And so we'll keep going here, and almost done to the end. Okay, so we're at that last stitch, and what do we have? So in this case, I said the chain 2 counts as a stitch. So this is my first stitch right here on the end where I did that chain 2. That's going to be stitch number 1. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So I have 11 stitches just like I did in the beginning. And we're just going to do the exact same thing. You're going to chain 2 and turn. And again, that chain 2 counts as a stitch. So we're not putting anything into that first space. And so if the pattern said that the chain 2 did not count as a stitch, you would actually crochet into that space. But because I say it does, we don't crochet into that space. We're going to go into the next space and crochet into the next double crochet. And again, you do that to the end. And so this row, I want you to pay attention to when we get to the end of this row, because it's very important that to get the 11 stitches, and I think this is where some people are getting confused, or where their blanket starts coming out lopsided, is because they're not crocheting into the very last stitch. Remember, I said my chain 2 counts as a stitch. So guess what? We have to do a double crochet into the top of that chain 2 space. Here's my chain 2. I have to put a double crochet into that space, or I'm going to be missing a stitch, and that's when your blanket starts coming out lopsided. See, if I miss this stitch and I just chain 2 here and turn, look at that space that I've already had because I did not crochet into my last stitch. So you want to be sure that you are crocheting into that chain 2, or you're going to end up with a lopsided blanket. So you go to the end here and you do a double crochet into the chain 2 space, and then if you go back and count them, what you have now is 1, because we're counting the chain 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. You're going to chain 2 and turn, and you're just going to keep doing that all the way throughout the pattern. Again, if the pattern says the chain 2 does not count as a space, you will crochet into the same space as that chain 2 or chain 3 or chain 1, whatever the turning chain count is. If it counts as a stitch, then you don't put anything there, because this is counting as your stitch, and what you want to be certain of when you get to the end of the row, that you crochet again into the chain 2 space. Now if this did not count as a stitch and you put a double crochet here, there would be a double crochet here on the other end that you would crochet into, so you don't have to worry about crocheting into the chain 2 space. So that's what needs to happen to ensure that you get even edges on your blanket. If you're crocheting in the round, it's important to make sure, so that you're not adding stitches in the round, that you know whether or not it counts as a stitch or not. So there you have it. Remember, don't get it twisted, get it crocheted.